We're kicking off a brand new series today called Are the Kids Okay? And it's all about helping families and kids flourish in an anxious world. If you're here this morning and you're brand new and someone's invited you and you thought, man, I can't believe I'm in church. I'm not even sure I believe in God. I'm not even sure I have any kind of faith, or I'm just really curious about Christians or the Christian faith, or you're just skeptical. I just want to let you know that you can belong here even if you aren't sure that you believe. And you're a part of us, even when you're not sure what you think about God. And we count it just a real privilege to be on the journey with you. And so we're excited that you're with us today. Now, as we kick off this whole series, which is going to help all of us, no matter who we are, aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents, sisters, brothers, cousins, how do we get in the corner of kids? We're going to talk about that in this series. But I want to start talking about parents because many of you are a parent or have had a parent or have a parent. So what I want to do is just talk about parents for a second. Parents are a huge influence on the life of a child. This is something that we all know. Even an absent parent has an impact on the life of a child. If you've lost a parent at a young age, that's had a really big impact on your life. Good parenting has a big impact. Bad parenting, if we want to call it that, poor parenting, challenged parenting, also has the impact on the life of a child. Statistics would say parents have a really significant, if not the number one, influence in the life of a child, next to peers and smartphones. I think it kind of goes one between the other. Now, here's the other thing about parents. Parents sometimes have no idea what they're doing. And if you're a parent, you know that. If you're a friend of a parent, you've looked at your friend and thought, yeah, you don't have any idea you know what you're doing. And it's actually, and if you're a kid, you definitely have thought, my parents have no idea what they're doing. And it's daunting for someone like me to get up here and talk about parenting because I'm a parent like many of you. I'm trying to figure it out like some of you. And the interesting thing is I failed the very first day of parenting, if you can believe that. We had our son Gavin, brand new baby was born, and I had one job, keep this human being alive, right? That's the job. That's it. There's no puberty. There's no allowance. There's no girlfriends. It's just my son, keep him alive. And so we left the hospital. They didn't give us a manual. Maybe for some of you got one. We didn't get one. And they sent us home. We got home. Hours were passing. And Leslie was breastfeeding Gavin, and we couldn't get him to latch, and he wasn't eating. And it went by an hour, another hour, another hour, another hour. And this kid is not eating. And we're starting to panic. Eventually, she's crying. Then I'm crying. And then my sister, who's there, who doesn't have kids, who's there to cheer us on, is like, nobody here has any idea what they're doing. And at 3 a.m, I said to my sister, what are we going to do? Like, he hasn't eaten anything. Like, I have one job, and I cannot keep this kid alive. And so what I did is I did what I do with other things that aren't working. I returned it. I said, I'm going to return it. I'm going to return it. And so I called the hospital. I called the delivery ward, and I said, I need to bring my son back. And they said, do you have a receipt? No, they didn't say that. They said, and the woman said, you can't. You have to go to emergency. And I said, if we go to emergency, this, you can hear it, right? This kid is wailing in the background, and he won't eat anything, and this isn't going to be good. It's only the first day. And so she said, listen. She started to take pity on me. She said, listen, I'm not allowed to let you back in after we've discharged you. But she said, here's what I'm going to do. Come down to the delivery ward. I'm going to meet you at a particular door that I'm going to prop open, and I'm going to sneak you in. And so, under the cover of darkness, Leslie and I, it's 3 a.m, we drive down to the delivery ward where there is a prop door where this nurse whisks us in. She puts us in this tiny examination area, closes the curtain so nobody knows we're there, and she gets this baby to latch. I mean, it was like a teenager at the Mandarin. I mean, he was just drinking and drinking. I'm crying with joy. Leslie's crying with joy. And it was like, oh, like this baby's going to live. Right? And then we got sent home to figure out the next day. And the next day we had just as little idea as what we were doing the first day. And we had to get some people around us to help us all of this, figure this out. And some of you are like, man, I can't believe you tried to return your baby, but let's be honest, some of you parents thought about returning your teenager, right? So parents, we really have very little idea what we're doing some days. And even I'm trying to figure it out. I just wouldn't want you to think just because I'm standing up here that we have everything figured out. But the thing I want to talk about in this series is that everyone cares about a kid in their life. Everybody's got a kid, a nephew, a niece, a grandchild, the kid of a friend, a neighbor, a sister, a brother, someone who you care about, and sometimes you feel the weight of, is this kid going to be okay? Is this kid going to turn out okay? What's going to happen with this kid? And over the course of the summer, I've been talking about this series with some friends. I'm going to do this series called Are the Kids Okay? That's the series. And what's so funny is I say, I'm going to do this series. I'm thinking about calling it Are the Kids Okay? And then they say to me, the kids are not okay. And I said, like, I'm not asking. This happened with multiple people. Like, I'm not asking you. It's like rhetorical. But the truth is, there is a realization that the kids are not okay. Now, listen to me. I've got lots of friends who lead wonderful summer camps and teacher friends. And I was a teacher, and my wife is a guidance counselor. We've dedicated our lives to kids. And there is an element of kids that will always be kids. Like, that is true. But there is something about growing up in today's culture that's just different. And I think not acknowledging it is putting our head in the sand. And I've done a bunch of reading on this over the course of the summer. A couple of the number of books I've read. A book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, which was kind of like the read of the summer for moms, I think, which is all about how smartphones are rewiring the brains of kids. And if you want to know what is going on in the lives of parents and kids today and what it's like, this book you can read. It's not a Christian book or anything, but you should read this book. And he's written a number of different books, The Coddling of the American Mind. He teaches out at the University of New York City. And then Jean Twenge, who wrote Generations, she talks about the difference between generations. So if you're trying to understand a generation, this is a really good book for you. She's out of San Diego State. She's also written a bunch of books. And there are lots of books out there that are talking about this challenge. But we all know, I'm going to actually show you something that we really all know, that we live in a more anxious generation than we ever have before. There was a study, a U.S. department, it's a National Department of Drugs and Health, and they did a survey, and they said, hey, how many people would describe themselves as being more anxious than they've been in the past? And this is the graph between 2008 and 2020, so it's pre-pandemic. And this is what the graph looks like, okay? Boomers, you guys are still pretty chill. 8% increase. So that's good. You can hug everyone else. 35 to 49, 52%. 26 to 34, 103%. 18 to 25, 139% increase. Right here, in this inflection point, anybody want to guess what happened right here? Smartphones became more and more available to more and more people. And that day when you were so excited, some of you remember, unlimited data on my phone. That was like right in here somewhere. And the more exposure that we've had to smartphones, there seems, and now it's more than just a correlation. Studies are showing that screens have changed us. And every generation, Jean Twenge shares in her book Generations, every generation has things that shape them. It's usually two things. It's events, major events, and major technological advancements. So I'm a Gen Xer, so for me it's 9/11 would be a major event that's changed our generation, and the prevalence of the internet. That's really changed, that shaped the lives of Gen Xers. For Gen Z and now Gen Alpha, the event is the pandemic, and the technical advancement are smartphones. The fact that we have this portal to the world in our pocket all the time, and what it exposes us to, and what it exposes kids to, and how it's changed how we have relationships. It's changed how we've operated in our lives. And if we're really honest, I think as adults, we kind of know that this is also true, that the adults are not okay either. that we realize that, man, things have changed in our culture. Things have changed in our world. That many of our friends are experiencing anxiety. In fact, thinking about the anxiety and depression that kids are facing makes us anxious and depressed. And what do we do? And what do we do as the world changes? And how do we walk with our kids to see them flourish in an anxious world? How do you walk with the kids that you love to see them flourish in an anxious world? Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a pastor. And when I look at the challenge, I look at it from a spiritual perspective. And one of the questions I ask is, what if part of the solution is ancient and spiritual? What if part of the solution to this, to walking with kids, is an ancient and spiritual one? Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, is very public that he is an atheist, and he devoted an entire chapter of this book to the importance of spirituality and spiritual practice, and how the erosion of that is creating more anxiety in our lives. And this is what he says. He says, this is an atheist, there is a God-shaped hole in every human heart. Or at least many people feel a yearning for meaning, connection, and spiritual elevation. A phone-based life, which is how he would describe our lives and describe our kids, phone-based versus play-based. A phone-based life often fills that hole with trivial and degrading content. The ancients advised us to be more deliberate in choosing what we expose ourselves to. The ancients, when you look back at spiritual practice over time, there's an encouragement to be way more intentional than maybe we are being about what we expose ourselves to. And so when it comes to directing kids, when it comes to, let's say, parenting kids, what's the goal? How can we be intentional? What are we parenting to? Andy and Sandra Stanley wrote a book on parenting. Andy's spoken on the screen here many times. In their book, it says this: our observation is that most parents are so busy parenting, they never stop to consider what they're parenting to. What is the goal of parenting? And what if part of the solution is an ancient and spiritual? What if part of the solution is ancient and spiritual? And here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to walk you through a passage of Scripture that will demonstrate to you ancient and spiritual practices that really help us to get in the corner of kids. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share with you really directly what some of the application of this looks like and what we're parenting to, what we're guiding kids towards, if part of being a human being is a spiritual thing. And then at the end, I'm going to give you something super practical that is going to help you moving forward, whoever you are, when it comes to whatever kid you're getting in the corner of. Now, we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 3 to 12. And here you have the Israelite people. This is 1,500 years before Jesus. These are God's chosen people. And they had been slaves to Egypt. And then a guy named Moses shows up, frees them from being slaves. And then they end up wandering the wilderness for 40 years, waiting for something God calls the promised land. That they're gonna be able to shake all the sand out of their sleeping bag, and they're going to be able to move into this promised land. And before they move in, the time has come, there are a bunch of guidelines that God has for them. But before he even gets to the guidelines, God says to Moses, I want you to speak to the people about their kids. I want you to speak to people about their family. And this is what it says. He says, listen closely, Israel, and be careful to obey. Then all will go well with you, and you will have many children in the land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, so part of that is a metaphor. It's not like there are streams of milk, okay, just so you know. Just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. What's he saying here? He's saying, first of all, as you move into this promised land, you're going to have many generations of kids here. And what's interesting is he says, listen closely. He doesn't say, listen closely, parents. He doesn't say, hey, we're going to talk about the kids. Listen closely, grandparents. He doesn't say, hey, we're going to talk about the kids. Listen closely, teachers. He says, listen closely, Israel. Everyone. He's saying kids are a community responsibility. That we're all responsible for walking with the next generation. That spiritually walking with kids requires a wide circle. That spiritually walking with kids requires a wide circle. It's not just a parent and a child or two parents and a child, that it requires a much wider group of people. If Moses was standing here, he would say, the kids represented in this room, we're all responsible for them. We all need to walk alongside them. For me, one of the benefits of being a part of this church is people in this church who've walked alongside my own kids as they've grown up. When we first came to this church, my kids were the only kids in preschool at one service. And they had a leader who showed up there every week for them. That you need to have a wide circle of people. That is an ancient spiritual practice. The idea that it's just you and your kids and you got to figure it out, right? That didn't even work well for me. That didn't even get me through the first day. I had to call someone else. That you need to be able to phone a friend, have someone in your life, someone else pouring into your kids. He's saying this is all of our responsibility, not just parents. And then he says this, listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And then he says this. Well, first of all, he's saying, listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. What he means by that is other nations around them would have had multiple idols, multiple gods. He's saying, listen, as we go into this promised land, don't forget who God is. That God-shaped hole you have, don't try filling it with something else. I want you to remember who God is. And then he says this, listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And then you think he's going to say, and parents, here's what you got to do. Here's what you got to tell your kids. But this is what he says. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I'm giving you today. What's he saying here? He's saying, listen, before we get to all the things you want to tell your kids, like clean up their room and don't leave your stuff out on the counter and listen, you can't just leave your bags and shoes all around the front door. That's like personal therapy for me, that one. Before you get to all that stuff, and before you start pointing them to God and saying, kids, don't forget God, the question is, where are you at when it comes to your relationship with God? What he's really saying is it can't be in them if it's not in you. You can't lead your kids to places you haven't been. And what does it mean for you to be wholeheartedly committed to God? That spiritually walking with your kids requires you to make it personal first. That you've got to make faith personal to you. Here's a question for you. How close are you to God right now? Now, some of you will say, listen, I don't even know if I believe there's a God. I just showed up here today. Someone bribed me with brunch. I get that. But when you think about the kids in your life, if you're thinking, man, I want them to have a faith. I don't want them to have an empty God-shaped hole in their life. I want them to know something more than just the tangible in this world. I recognize that to be human is to be spiritual. The only way you're going to walk alongside them is if you take the journey first. And we'd love to have you here to help you with that. And some of you are here today, and you would say, I've been a follower of Jesus for a long time. And the question is, how close are you to God right now? As close as you would like your kids to be? As close as you would like your grandkids to be? For me, one of the things I love is my kids, I'm a pastor, so spiritual questions are weird in my house, right? Because it's well, you're a pastor, and so actually it's when do I ask Dad a question? Because he might give me a whole sermon, right? So, but I remember one of my boys just saying to me, Dad, you talk about hearing from God. I never heard from God before. That's it. Now, there's a lot of layers there, is there not? But man, what a special moment that is. Because what he sees is he sees me. He says, I hear you talking about hearing from God, but I never heard from him. And he sees me trying to read my Bible. He sees me in the opportunities I take to pray for him. And he looks at that and says, man, there's something in you that I'm trying to figure out how to get that in me. And when your kids look at your life, when your grandkids look at your life, when your nieces and nephews look at your life, when they see your life, do they say, man, that person, there's something between them and God, and I want to figure out how to get that in my life. My mom is really good at this, and I remember driving many times in our minivan. She'd be visiting, and I'd hear her in the back seat. This is how she would do it. She would say things like, man, like, look at how beautiful that water is. Isn't it amazing that God would make that water? And she's wanting to share, this is something personal to me. And then it says this. Then he says, okay, now that you're wholeheartedly trying to follow God and have a relationship with him, the things that he's telling you, the things that he's commanding you, repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road and when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. He says, tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Some of you are like, that's weird, like Post-its or what? Got to come back next week. I'm talking about this and screen time, okay? So write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. What's he saying here? He's saying, you got to make spiritual conversation normal with kids. Normalize spiritual conversation. Spiritually walking with kids requires a spiritual daily rhythm. It's a part of regular life, right? When your grandkids come over, the thing that you're not going to do is like pull out a pulpit, right? And be like, okay, kids, it's Bible time. Everybody sit down. But how do you actually make it a part of your daily rhythm? Questions like, when you think of God, what do you think of? Normal questions. When you pray, do you ever feel anything? When you think of Jesus and the challenge that you're facing, what do you think he would say? Normal, just questions, conversations about who God is. And some of you are like, man, like that might be awkward. Like I have a teenager. My kid is a teenager. And I would say, yes, it will be awkward. And you should do it anyway. Because the awkward things are the most powerful things. So often in our lives, right? Nobody says, man, I just had such a breakthrough in my comfort zone. A normal conversation. But if it's not in you, and you start talking to the kid in your life about God, all it's going to seem like is fake and forced. Because they don't see it in you. And then he says this, the Lord your God will soon bring you into the land he swore to give you. This promised land is going to be unbelievable. He says, when you made a vow to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's a land with large, prosperous cities that you did not build. The houses will be richly stocked with goods that you did not produce. You're going to take this land from your enemies. It's going to be unbelievable. He says, you will draw water from cisterns you did not dig. You will eat from vineyards and olive trees you did not plant. Can you imagine you've been living in a tent for 40 years and somebody tells you this is how you're going to live now? And then he says this. He says this. He says, when you have eaten your fill in the land, be careful not to forget the Lord, who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. He said, when you finally get what you want, don't forget God. We live in one of the most affluent societies in the world. And yes, sometimes we figure out, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to afford a house, or apartment rent is expensive, or interest rates or whatever the talk of the day is. But the truth is, we live in one of the most affluent parts of the whole world. And when you look at history, the access that we have between phones and screens and internet and the ability to fly places, and you look at the time we live in, it is the most prosperous time you could argue in our entire history. And maybe, when you look back, we've never been more anxious than we are today. Could it be that we have so much in our lives that we have forgot God? That we take that God-shaped hole and we've tried to stuff it with everything else. A new cottage, a new kitchen, a new boat, a new whatever. And it fills for a time, doesn't it? When you show your friends, and where'd you get the countertops? Oh, I got them, and all that stuff, right? And then what happens? Your kid puts a crayon on the countertop, and now you don't show it to anybody. And 20 years later, 10 years later, it's in a dumpster. And what are you going to do? Fill that hole with another countertop? Could it be, listen, to be a human being is a spiritual thing. God created us to be spiritual beings. He created us to be in relationship with Him. And when we start stuffing that hole with other things and we forget God, it lands us in an anxious place, whether we realize it or not. And what Moses is begging of the people here is do not let, man, after 40 years of wandering the desert, you're going to get the promised land. Do not forget God. And he says, the way I want you to remind them is with these ancient practices. The ancient practices of widen the circle in your life, of other people speaking in the life of a child. Make it personal. Make sure that it's in you if it's going to be in them. Create a rhythm. Create a regular, normalized conversation about God in your life with the kids in your life. You know, I want to tell you a mistake that I made as a parent. I thought that the goal of parenting was to create an independent child. I did. That the goal is like, you know what? They're going to stand on their own 2 feet. They're going to have a job, and they're going to have a career, and they're going to be able to take care of their spouse, and they're going to have a car, and they're going to have like all of these things that you think are like measures of independence. That what I'm trying to do is create an independent child. And you know what dawned on me? I don't know any adults who are truly independent. We're all dependent on someone or something. You're dependent on your job. You're dependent on your house. You're dependent on your spouse. You're dependent on money. You're dependent on leisure. We're all dependent on something. Some of us are dependent on some things that are way more unhealthy than that. We're dependent on alcohol. We're dependent on destructive relationships. None of us are truly independent. So then what is the goal? Because here's the thing I realized, that when I had a kid move out to university last year, and that will rock some of your worlds. I'll tell you that right now. And what you realize is it's not that your child will be independent. It's what choices will they make about what or who they will be dependent on. The goal isn't to raise an independent child. It's to raise a God-dependent adult. And what does it mean to walk alongside the kids in your life that you might raise a God-dependent adult? That when the job disappears, or their marriage falls apart, or the car payment gets missed, or they get that diagnosis, that you know at the end of the day that when it comes to the hole in their heart, they're not dependent on those things, but they're dependent on a God who never changes. Because I'll tell you a secret. The car, the money, the house, it's going to go away for all of us eventually. And who will we be dependent on then? What doesn't change then? Who will be there with us then? God-dependent people raising God-dependent adults. And what we often do, I get this as parents. We love our kids, right? And grandparents, you get caught in this same trap. You love your grandkids, but here's what happens. You can start to take your grandchild and put them in the seat of meaning and purpose in your life. You can take your kids and put them in the seat of meaning and purpose in your life. You try to get them to fill that hole, right? You go, well, if they don't get straight A's, I don't feel good about myself. If they don't get picked for the team, I don't feel good about myself. If they're failing school, I must have failed as a parent. And what we do is we try to set it up so that we fill that hole with a child in our life. Or we love to set it up that we're the one who gives them all meaning and purpose, right? My son, he's going into second year of university, and there's a Facebook group for parents of kids, and I follow it for sheer entertainment. Because there are parents on there who are freaking. There is a woman on there. I'm not going to name the university, so you don't go find this. There is a woman on there who was like, listen, I'm really nervous. My kid moves into residence. I'm worried there's going to be a run on bed sheets at Walmart. Can anybody go to Walmart and confirm for me there will be bed sheets when I move my child in? And some of the res rooms are like bomb shelters, right? Because it's like, I don't want them to not have anything. And anything they need, I'm going to send, Amazon's going to send it right away. And let's be honest, parents, sometimes we're doing that because it makes us feel good. Not just because we're trying to help. That fills a hole for us. And it's not fair when you take your kid and you ask them to fill a hole that only God was meant to fill. And it's not, and some of you have kids who are adults, and they didn't make the choices you wanted, and you're still mad that they're not filling the hole for you. When they were never designed to fill that hole in the very first place. What does it mean to raise God-dependent adults? A God-dependent adult. God-dependent, when it comes to you and a kid in your life, means God, our Father, controls meaning and purpose for us. In the context of a family. Right? When God controls meaning and purpose, I'm not trying to get my child to give me meaning and purpose. And when God controls meaning and purpose, we're not trying to get sports, we're not trying to get music, we're not trying to get art, we're not trying to get friends. Ultimately, we're looking to God for meaning and purpose. And here's what's so special about that. Because when you look to God for meaning and purpose in your life, as a family, as a grandparent and grandkids, it changes conversations about forgiveness. Doesn't it? Because now it's not about you owe me. How come you haven't forgiven me? You hurt me. It's like, hey, the God that we're trying to follow with our lives, the God that we're dependent on, models forgiveness for us. Models unconditional love for us. You know, I think I'm so glad that I can share all my mistakes so that everybody can take from them. But I think I thought that my kids would remember all the advice I gave them. And they don't. But here's the thing. I think kids remember when you ask them to forgive you, don't they? The moment mom and dad sat down and said, I really screwed up. I lost my temper. I said something I shouldn't have. I apologize. I'm really sorry. Kids remember that kind of thing. Some of you wish you had a parent who said that kind of thing. Kids don't forget that stuff. And to create an environment like that means that God is giving us meaning and purpose, and we are looking to Him for how we should treat one another. And we are looking to Him for how we should treat our neighbor. And we are looking to Him for how we should treat other people and how we should treat our friends. Because at the end of the day, He is the one giving us meaning and purpose. What I really feel for is the dynamic in parenting right now where there is this just pressure of perfection. That parents are trying to get it perfect. And it's like, if we don't get it, and like, it's like, my kid didn't get into whatever, I'm going to call and rage on that coach or rage on that teacher. And I know some of you have done that. So, because you're all looking down at the ground. And because we think, I just got to get it all right. And if I just get it perfect, then what? Then what? Then what? Then what? Your life's going to be perfect? How do you finish that sentence? Your life will be perfect if you get it perfect? Or the pressure of like, my kids have got to get it perfect, and unless my kid turns out perfect, I'm not going to be okay. There's such a pressure of perfection. Perfection is not the goal. The goal of parenting isn't perfection, but pointing to our Father who is. I can't tell you the gift that this is to me, the pressure that this relieves me of. Because one day, you will pack that kid's suitcase, or as a grandparent, you will be the second car that takes the kid to university because it doesn't all fit in one car. And you will drop them off, and you will be so grateful if you spend your life pointing to the Father who will be there for them when you're not. that when you point them to God the Father, who fills in the blanks when you screw up, who shows up when you're not there. Because here's sadly what I know is true. One day, for my boys, I'm not going to be around. I don't know when that day will be, but I know the Father who will be. And if I spend my life pointing them to him, and they live a God-dependent life, I've given them the greatest gift I could ever give them. That they would know this verse in 2 Corinthians is true. The verse says, "All praise to God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others." This is the parent that I want my kids to know, who shows up when I can't, and shows up when I drop the ball for the 100th time, who fills in the gap when I drop the ball. Now, I just want to speak to something specific here. I recognize the weight of this, and I want to be so careful. There are some of you who are here today who you are living in the resignation of regret. I didn't do this right. I didn't do this with the kid the way I should have. And now they're an adult, and they don't know anything. They're not following God. They're not following Jesus, and I thought I was doing it the right way, and now I think I haven't. And I just want to let you know that you will not stop being a parent in that case. And that God still has stories that he wants to write. And that you can still point your kids to God, even in their adulthood, with the way that you live. That this just isn't for parents of kids. And if you're a grandparent, you are such a gift. If you're an uncle and aunt, you are such a gift. If you're here today and you're struggling to have kids, and that's the journey that you've been on, and it's so emotional and challenging, I want you to know that this is a community thing, that we need you investing in the lives of our kids. And for those of you living in the paralysis of perfection, the goal isn't for you to be perfect. The goal is for you to point to the Father who is. So this series is going to get super practical. I'm going to talk about screen time, and some of you are like, when is screen time coming? I'm dying on the screen time. It's going to get practical. But at the end of the day, loving kids is a matter of the heart. And we want to point them to God who loves them. And so we want to be in your corner over the course of this series. And here's what we're going to do today. We're going to give you this gift. It's this picture frame that says the goal of parenting isn't perfection, but pointing to our Father who is. But we have different cards for the frame. So we've got a grandparent one, we've got an uncle one, we've got an aunt one, we've got a small group leader one, we've got a friend one. We've got one with a blank. So we've got somebody out there who's like a calligraphy person. They can write it in for you, whatever it is. And then there's a QR code here on the bottom, and if you scan it, we are building, it's already got a lot on it, a very substantial resource page for different age groups, how to have faith conversations, how to have conversations about anxiety. There's tools about screen time. There's podcasts there. I do a book review of all the books I read for this series. Would really encourage you to check that out. It's also at connexuschurch.com/nextgen. So that's kind of the Monday morning content. If you want to go there, connexuschurch.com/nextgen. And then in addition to that, I'm doing a bonus podcast on our podcast platform every week in this series where I interview a different expert. This week's podcast guest is Chris Tompkins. Chris is a friend of mine and the CEO of Muskoka Woods. They see 25,000 guests a year, and they have over 400 Gen Z staff. And I spend some time interviewing him about Gen Z. So if you've got an adult kid, you will find this so helpful. It talks about how they see life, how they see work, how they see their spirituality. It's kind of a 10-minute intro, and then he kind of jumps into it. Super, super helpful. And we've got different guests going to be joining us every week on the podcast. Because we want to be in your corner on this. Because we want to be in the corner of kids. Because God calls us as a community to point kids to him. And in a moment, we're going to sing a song called Jehovah Jireh. And some of you are like, Jehovah, what are you talking about? I don't understand that language. Jehovah Jireh is a name that the Israelite people would have used for God our provider. And as we sing this song today, let's surrender the kids in our life. Let's surrender the situations in our life. Let's surrender the heartache in our life around him, knowing at the end of the day, he is the one who is perfect. He is the one who provides. He is the one who writes better stories. He's not into perfect pictures, but wants to write stories of redemption in the lives of kids, in the lives of family, and guess what? In your life too. Let me pray. God, we come to you today, and we thank you for who you are. We thank you that you are a loving Father who cares about us, who loves us, who knows us. And God, we just pray for the kids in our lives, whoever that is we think of, a brother, sister, niece, nephew, grandkid, child in our life, if we're a parent. And whatever guilt we feel, we just bring that to you. We don't want to resign in regret. We don't want to be paralyzed by perfection. But we want to do the work of pointing kids to you, that they might know you. And God, we want to know you too. Lead and guide us as we look to lead and guide kids to Jesus. We pray all of this in your name.